I've always followed the rules, every line, every detail. As a software engineer, my mind works like that. Everything's precise, organized, right on track. That was until the day a simple can of paint completely changed my fate. My garage needed a new coat of paint, and I picked a shade of gray that seemed just perfect to keep the neighborhood's vibe. 3 hours of work on a Saturday afternoon, and it was done. I stood back, satisfied with the final look, thinking about how that color meshed so well with the rest of the house. A week later, one letter changed everything. The fine almost made me choke. $155,000. The reason? According to the Homeowners Association, the shade of gray was 3 times darker than allowed. And that's when I realized, sometimes following the rules just isn't enough when someone decides you're in the wrong. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. I grabbed the phone right away and called the condo management. The secretary, in a flat tone, kept repeating that all complaints had to be made in writing. I sent 3 detailed emails explaining that I'd consulted the regulations manual before picking the color. No reply. After 2 weeks of radio silence, I finally managed to set up a meeting with Victoria Harrison, the association's president. I walked into her office with color samples, photos, and the regulations manual tucked under my arm. Victoria barely looked up from her desk as I started explaining my case. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped on the table like she was counting the seconds until she could dismiss me. "Mr. Parker, the rules are clear," she said, adjusting her expensive glasses. "The shade you chose clearly violates our guidelines. The fine stands." I tried to argue and show her the color samples, but she raised her hand, cutting me off. "If you don't agree, you can appeal to the board. But let me warn you, we never lose a case." I left that room feeling my face burn. On my way home, I walked down the main street of the neighborhood, and something caught my eye. The Thompson family's house had a garage almost identical to mine. Same shade of gray. Why didn't they get fined? That's when I started to suspect that something was really wrong in that seemingly perfect place. The next few days were a nightmare. Neighbors who used to say hello started avoiding eye contact. Invitations to Sunday barbecues disappeared. My daughter Sophie came home from school in tears because Amanda, the Williams daughter, said her parents didn't want any trouble with the association, so she couldn't play with her anymore. At dinner, Sophie sat playing with her food, looking down. "Dad, why is everyone mad at us?" Her question broke my heart. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that grown-ups can be so petty? "Is it true we have to sell the house?" she went on. The rumors had already reached the school playground. The isolation grew worse. At the monthly HOA meetings, no one sat near me. It felt like I had a contagious disease. Sophie even started faking stomach aches to avoid going to school. Her teacher called me, worried, saying that some kids were teasing her, calling us the ugly house of the neighborhood. The pressure started to affect my work. I lost focus in online meetings, and my code began showing simple errors. My boss noticed and called me in for a talk. How do I explain that a simple garage color is tearing my life apart? At night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the fine amount in my head. $155,000 was all my savings, the money I had set aside for Sophie's college. I couldn't just pay up and pretend nothing happened. Something was off, really off. One sleepless night, sitting in the living room and staring out the window, I saw Victoria Harrison walking her dog. She stopped in front of my house, made a face of disapproval, and then kept moving. That was the moment I decided. I wasn't going to take this lying down. If they wanted war, they were messing with the wrong guy. It was time to find out what was really going on in that so-called perfect neighborhood. I started my investigation like I do with my software projects. Methodically, I made a detailed spreadsheet with every house in the neighborhood, their colors, and any changes over the past 5 years. On Saturday mornings, before the neighbors were up, I'd stroll around snapping photos of every property. Patterns started emerging. The Thompsons' house, with the garage identical to mine, belonged to Victoria's brother. The Williams, who painted their facade in a beige that was clearly off-standard, were cousins of the association's treasurer. And the Andersons' oddly shaped pool? Well, they coincidentally hosted monthly dinners where Victoria was always the guest of honor. I dug through the public records for the neighborhood. Every citizen has that right. I discovered something even more disturbing. In the last 3 years, all the hefty fines had been given to residents who had dared to question Victoria's decisions. The Brazilian couple who complained about the rising maintenance fee got fined for unauthorized plants. The retired teacher who suggested a financial audit, fined for irregular backyard structure. But the worst was yet to come. I found a revealing document. Victoria had changed the allowed color specifications 3 days before I painted my garage. The shade I chose was within the previous rules. She changed the rules without notifying the residents. I put together a complete dossier. Screenshots of emails, comparison photos, official documents, everything meticulously organized. All those years dealing with software documentation finally paid off for something other than work. I even created an algorithm to analyze how the fines were applied. The numbers didn't lie. One night, while I was sorting through the evidence, Sophie came into my makeshift office. "Dad, what are all these papers?" I explained in simple terms that I was gathering proof that we were being treated unfairly. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised me. Just like when Amanda copied my homework, and the teacher found out because her mistakes were the same as mine. Exactly what my daughter said. Victoria had left traces of her favoritism, little patterns that, when put together, painted a clear picture of abuse of power. I discovered she was using her position to benefit friends and family, while harshly punishing anyone who dared to question her authority. The last straw was when I found an email where she was discussing with another board member about making an example out of my case. Apparently, I had been chosen as a scapegoat to show what happens to those who don't respect the authority of the association. That night, after tucking Sophie in, I sat in my garage, the infamous garage with the wrong shade of gray, and looked over all the evidence. It was clear that this wasn't just about a can of paint anymore. It was about justice, about stopping other families from going through what we were going through. I needed professional help. It was time to call Nathan. Nathan and I go way back to college when we shared a dorm. While I spent nights coding, he was busy crafting cool programs. Now, 20 years later, I was in his office explaining my situation. As I laid out all my evidence, I saw his eyes light up, that same spark he gets when he finds a good legal loophole. "Robert, this is bigger than a simple dispute over a garage color," he said, adjusting his tie. "We've got clear abuse of power, selective rule enforcement, and possible illicit enrichment." Nathan started making notes furiously in his yellow pad. We spent the next few weeks building the case. Nathan explained that we needed more than just to prove how arbitrary the fine was. We were going to expose the whole corrupt system. He brought in a real estate appraisal expert to show that my garage didn't hurt the neighboring property values. He also hired a color specialist to confirm that the difference between the allowed shade and the one I used was negligible. "Let's turn their strategy against them," Nathan explained. "They want to make an example out of you? Great. Let's turn this into an example of how HOAs shouldn't abuse their power." Then he outlined our plan. First, file a lawsuit contesting the fine. Then, request an investigation into every decision made by the HOA in the last 3 years. We spent an entire afternoon prepping my testimony. Nathan asked me the toughest questions, getting me ready for the worst. "Victoria's going to play dirty," he warned. "She'll try to paint you as a troublemaker, maybe even bring up meetings you missed or fees you delayed." The craziest part was when Nathan told me that other residents had come to his office with similar complaints, but backed off, scared of retaliation. "You're not alone in this fight, Robert. You're just the first with the guts to take them on." We drafted a 47-page document detailing every irregularity we'd uncovered. Nathan also prepared a series of subpoenas for all the board members, demanding their personal financial records from the past 5 years. "This is going to make them sweat," he grinned. On the eve of filing the lawsuit, Nathan asked one final question. "Are you sure you want to follow through with this? They're going to fight you with everything they've got." I looked at the photo of Sophie in my wallet, remembering the tears in her eyes when the other kids stopped playing with her. "Absolutely," I replied. "Then get ready," Nathan said, organizing the documents in his folder. "Because tomorrow we're going to show Victoria Harrison that she picked the wrong garage to mess with." That night, leaving his office, I felt, for the first time in months, that I had a real shot at winning. It wasn't just about my garage anymore. It was about justice for the whole community. The case quickly caught the local media's attention. A reporter from the Los Angeles Times did a story on how homeowners associations were becoming more authoritarian. My story became the centerpiece of the report, the garage that cost more than a house. Social media exploded. A video I made showing the difference between my garage and the others in the neighborhood went viral. Groups advocating homeowners' rights started sharing my story. I received hundreds of messages from people across the country who had experienced similar situations. Community support began to show in unexpected ways. Mrs. Martinez, who lived 3 houses down, came to me with documents showing how she was forced to remove her medicinal herb garden, while Victoria's pals got away with their landscaping messes. Mr. Thompson, a retired accountant, offered to review the condo's financial records that we'd obtained through the lawsuit. One day, as Sophie and I were coming back from the grocery store, we found a group of residents gathered on our sidewalk. My heart pounded, thinking it was some kind of protest against us. To my surprise, they were there to show support. They had discovered that Victoria was planning to drastically raise the condo fees to cover legal costs. The story got even bigger when a local TV channel did a live report from the neighborhood. Victoria tried to stop the crew from getting in, which only made everything look even more shady. The reporter managed to interview several residents who finally had the courage to speak about other abuses they'd suffered. Social media took the case to another level. An influencer who focuses on real estate rights made a video analyzing our situation, and it reached millions of views. "This case represents everything that's wrong with out-of-control HOAs," he said. The video sparked a flood of comments from people sharing similar experiences. Public pressure started to get to Victoria. She tried holding a press conference to defend herself, but her explanations about slight differences in shades of gray sounded ridiculous when compared to the evidence. Her attempt to paint me as a problematic resident backfired when former neighbors came out to defend my character. The most surreal moment came when Sophie got home from school telling me that her story had become an essay topic in her English class. The teacher had asked the students to write about justice and courage, using our case as an example. The same kids who had once avoided her now wanted to know every single detail of the process. The case's exposure also revealed other issues in the neighborhood. Residents began questioning where the maintenance fees were really going. Why did some areas always get upgrades while others were neglected? Why did some residents get instant approval for renovations while others waited for months? Victoria no longer strolled around the neighborhood with that superior air. Now she hurried along with her head down, avoiding eye contact. The house of cards she had built was starting to crumble for everyone to see. The day of the trial arrived on a sunny Tuesday morning. The courtroom was packed. Residents from the neighborhood, journalists, and even people who had read about my story online all wanted to see how it would end. Sophie insisted on skipping school to be there. Sitting next to me, she gripped my hand tightly. Victoria walked into the room with her expensive lawyers, dressed in a pristine suit. She tried to keep up her authoritarian act, but you could tell she was nervous by the way she kept adjusting her glasses. Nathan nudged me and whispered, "She knows we're ready." Judge Thompson, a sharp-eyed lady in her 60s, began going through the documents. As she read, her eyebrows kept rising. When she got to the side-by-side photos of the different garages, she called for a break to take a closer look. "Mrs. Harrison," the judge said, removing her glasses, "could you explain why properties with the same shade got treated so differently?" Victoria started a muddled explanation about light angles and color perception. The judge interrupted her. "I'm more interested in why the color regulation was changed 3 days before Mr. Parker painted his garage without proper notice to the residents." Nathan then presented our strongest evidence, a clear pattern of favoritism and retaliation in the HOA's decisions. He showed how heavy fines were imposed selectively, always targeting residents who questioned the management. The judge listened intently, scribbling detailed notes. The decisive moment came when Victoria's defense tried arguing that strict rules were necessary to maintain property values. The judge then asked the question everyone was waiting for. If it's all about property values, how does a $155,000 fine over a barely noticeable shade difference benefit the community? Victoria started sweating. Her lawyers exchanged frantic whispers. The judge continued, "In 25 years on the bench, I've seen many HOA cases, but I've never seen such blatant abuse of power." She flipped through a few more pages of the case file. "What worries me isn't just this absurd fine, but the systematic authoritarian and discriminatory behavior." When the color specialist presented his technical report, showing that the difference between the two shades was practically imperceptible to the human eye, I saw Victoria slouch in her chair. Her house of cards was crumbling right there in court. The judge fired off a series of straight questions about the association's finances, the arbitrary rule changes, and the unequal treatment of residents. Every response from Victoria sounded weaker than the last. At one tense moment, she couldn't explain why her own brother never received fines for similar violations. Sophie squeezed my hand tighter as the judge began her final remarks. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone knew that this moment wasn't just about a gray garage. It was about justice, fairness, and the limits of the power we give to institutions over our lives. The judge's decision was clear. Not only did she cancel the $155,000 fine, but she also ordered that the HOA pay all my legal fees. She went even further. She mandated a full audit of the association's finances for the past 5 years and demanded the immediate resignation of Victoria and her entire board. This court cannot allow a homeowners association to turn into a personal kingdom where the rules only apply to those who aren't in favor with management, the judge declared. She also ordered the HOA to issue a public apology and set up an independent committee to review all fines imposed during Victoria's reign. The impact was immediate. Victoria left the courtroom with her head down, surrounded by reporters she'd tried so hard to avoid. Several residents came over to hug me, some crying, grateful that I had the courage to take on the system. An elderly neighbor told me she could finally plant her roses without fear of repercussions. Changes in the neighborhood started the very next day. A temporary management board was set up, with representatives elected democratically by the residents. The first steps included revising all the arbitrary rules and creating a transparent process for approving changes to homes. Nathan was over the moon. "This case will set a precedent for other neighborhoods," he said. "You not only won your battle, but you created a legal precedent that will protect thousands of people." Sophie was invited back to birthday parties, and now she understood something even more important: that fighting for what's right, even when it seems impossible, is totally worth it. On the night after the trial, as we were getting ready for a celebratory dinner, she told me, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer like Uncle Nathan, to help people who are being treated unfairly." The most rewarding part was seeing how the community began to heal. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other started coming together to discuss improvements for the neighborhood. Decisions began to be made collectively, transparently, with everyone's input. And my garage? It stayed the same shade of gray, now a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. The judge's ruling not only scrapped the fine, but also required the HOA to cover all my legal costs and issue a formal apology. Victoria was removed from her position, and a full audit of the condo's finances was ordered. The association had to review all its policies and establish a more transparent system for enforcing the rules. The news spread like wildfire. My case became a legal precedent referenced in similar disputes all over the country. I received invitations to share my story at conferences about homeowners' rights. Residents from other neighborhoods started reaching out, asking for advice on how to deal with similar situations. The impact on our neighborhood was immediate. A new board was elected, with a more diverse representation of residents. Monthly meetings, once dominated by Victoria and her cronies, turned into open forums where everyone could speak freely without fear of retaliation. But the most significant changes happened in the little things. Neighbors started greeting each other again on the streets. Sunday barbecues made a comeback, with even more attendees than before. Sophie got her friendships back and even organized a sleepover, the first in months. Victoria put her house on the market 2 weeks after the trial. On the morning she moved out, I watched from my window as the moving truck drove away. I didn't feel any satisfaction over her defeat, just relief that our community could finally start over. The shade of gray on my garage stays the same to this day, but now it represents something different. It's no longer a symbol of conflict. It's a reminder that it's worth fighting for what's right. Like Sophie said recently while playing with her friends in the garage, "Dad, this is the prettiest color in the world because it's the color of courage." Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this.